All right, let's just jump right into it. Welcome to This Explainer, where today we are going to completely dissect one of North America's absolute most terrifying urban legends. I want you to really picture this for a second. Have you ever been driving down an isolated road late at night? You know the kind. The trees seem to literally close in around your car. Your headlights are barely piercing the darkness, and suddenly you catch a glimpse of something moving just beyond the edge of the light. Well, today we are going to lean completely into that exact fear. We're examining a legendary creature that has supposedly haunted the deep, silent woods and winding dirt roads of the United States for decades now. We are talking glowing eyes, abandoned asylums, and feral humanoids lurking in the shadows. It is pure nightmare fuel. But more importantly, we're going to peel back the layers to find the surprising and honestly pretty tragic truth behind all this horror. So lock your doors, turn down the lights, and let's get into it.
So imagine you're actually on that pitch black, narrow dirt road. It's enveloped by thick, heavy woods. Your headlights are flashing against the dense trees, and they're casting these long, distorted, frankly super eerie shadows across your path. Maybe the radio suddenly fades to static, and the silence outside is just deafening. Then, seemingly out of nowhere, you see a small, shadowy figure completely dart across the road. It pauses just long enough for you to register this impossibly large, swollen silhouette against the moonlight before it vanishes. Terrifying, right? Well, warnings passed around by locals pleading with people to beware the Melonheads after dark. They perfectly capture the sheer panic that communities have felt for literal generations. You gotta understand, people don't just tell these stories as fun little campfire tales to casually spook each other. No way. In a lot of these places, these warnings are treated as absolute, ironclad survival rules for anyone foolish enough to wander into the dark. Now, what's really wild to me, and honestly truly terrifying, is how these creatures are almost universally described across completely different states. I mean, it doesn't matter if you're deep in the woods of the Midwest or if you're navigating the coastal backcountry of New England, the physical description remains horribly, consistently the same. Eyewitness accounts and all those hushed local rumors describe them as small, almost childlike in stature, but they have these incredibly gaunt and emaciated limbs. And their defining feature, the thing that gives them their namesake, obviously, is their disproportionately large, bulbous heads. Sometimes they're described as totally hairless, covered in thick, pulsing veins. Yeah, pretty gross. And it gets worse. They're described as completely feral, strictly nocturnal, intensely territorial, and incredibly dangerous. People say they have these glowing eyes that reflect the moonlight, and a voracious, insatiable hunger for literally anyone who strays too far off the beaten path. It's like a horror movie monster brought to life. But here is where it gets really fascinating. Think about the local origins. We've got Ohio, Michigan, and Connecticut, and each one completely customizes the horror. It's like a giant puzzle where the core nightmare remains exactly the same, but the legend adapts like a highly contagious virus. You know, folklore rarely just sticks to one single root cause. Instead, what happens is communities continuously remix the explanations to perfectly suit their own local landscapes and their own specific anxieties. The monster is always this big-headed sterile creature, but the terrifying origin story shifts. It totally depends on whether the local area has a creepy old abandoned mansion, or maybe a winding dirt road that locals actively avoid, or even a deeply rooted dark history of colonial witch trials. So let's actually break down exactly how these highly localized nightmares took shape, starting with our first region. Section 1. Ohio's sinister Dr. Crow. Okay, so we are starting off in the dark, dense woods of Kirtland, Ohio. And this is where the legend takes on the unmistakable, absolutely gruesome flavor of a classic mad scientist horror movie. In this particular terrifying tale, the government supposedly enlists this mysterious, shadowy figure named Dr. Crow, and they put him in charge of running a secretive medical facility hidden deep, deep in the forest near Wisner Road. His supposed job? Caring for abandoned orphans who are afflicted with hydrocephalus, which is a condition that causes a massive buildup of fluid in the brain. But as you can probably guess, Dr. Crow isn't a savior, not even close. The legend claims he was a sadistic monster. He pushed these already vulnerable, marginalized children to the absolute brink. He supposedly conducted unbelievably cruel experiments, actively injecting chemicals and even more fluid into their brains, causing their heads to grotesquely balloon in size. Just awful stuff. And this immense, unthinkable torture eventually leads to a bloody, inevitable rebellion. The children supposedly violently murder and completely dismember Dr. Crow, burn the abusive facility right to the ground, and then just vanish into the shadows of the dense woods. And the story goes that they still hide out there to this day, fiercely guarding their territory and basically cannibalizing anyone who happens to wander a little too close to their domain. Section 2. The Michigan Asylums. Now, shifting our focus over to the eerie shores of Lake Michigan, the story actually moves away from a single evil doctor and shifts heavily toward widespread institutional abuse. Right near Saugatuck State Park sits this historic, looming property called the Felt Mansion. And local lore absolutely insists that right next to this grand, decaying estate stood the Junction Insane Asylum. The story here goes that children suffering from hydrocephalus were kept in this asylum and subjected to just unspeakable physical and emotional abuse by the entire staff. And just like in Ohio, they hit an absolute breaking point, which leads to a violent, bloody uprising. These feral children are said to have murdered the primary abusive doctor. But here's the twist. They had absolutely no place to hide his body. So, chillingly, the legend says they chopped him up into tiny, unrecognizable pieces and hid his remains all throughout the vast Felt Mansion before retreating into this massive network of pitch-black underground caves. And to this very day, thrill-seeking teenagers who go trespassing at the mansion in the dead of night, they still claim to see the ghosts of these children. Some even swear up and down they've seen the horrifying shadow of the doctor's murder literally cast against the walls in the pale moonlight. Creepy, right?
Section 3. Connecticut's Exiled Clans. Moving further east into Connecticut, the legend completely sheds the whole mad scientist and asylum tropes. Instead, it goes for something deeply rooted in colonial paranoia and chilling isolation. In Fairfield and New Haven counties, the Melonheads are heavily localized around these incredibly creepy single-lane dirt roads, the most famous one being Velvet Street, which the locals ominously and, very appropriately, nicknamed Dracula Drive. Out here, you actually get two distinct, terrifying origin stories. The first theory claims that a devastating 1960 asylum fire left unaccounted for inmates who fled into the brutal, freezing winter woods, and they basically had to resort to horrific cannibalism just to survive the harsh elements. But the second, and honestly much more pervasive theory, claims these creatures are actually the direct descendants of a colonial-era family who were accused of witchcraft and banished from polite society centuries ago. Forced into deep, unforgiving isolation, generations of severe inbreeding supposedly resulted in these horrific genetic mutations. So, whether they are desperate asylum escapees driven utterly mad by hunger, or an outcast clan of accused witches, the Connecticut Melonheads serve as a really grim, flesh-eating cautionary tale. The message is simple. Whatever you do, stay out of the deep woods.
Okay, so we have painted quite a terrifying picture here, haven't we? I mean, ghostly children, dismembered doctors, cannibalistic mutants aimlessly wandering down Dracula Drive looking for their next meal. It's intense. But after scaring ourselves completely silly with these wild campfire tales, it is time to officially turn on the lights. It's time to fully gut this legend and ask the big question. What historical realities actually birthed these terrifying monsters in the first place? What is actually hiding in the dark?
Section 4. Dissecting the folklore. The absolutely crucial point here is separating the terrifying fiction from the deeply human and sometimes profoundly tragic truth. Because let's be real, monsters don't just magically appear out of nowhere, right? They are constructed by us, by society. We absolutely have to shift our mindset right now from a B horror movie to medical reality. Because the true tragedy here isn't some spooky creature hiding in the woods. It's how communities historically took a very real, very misunderstood medical condition and completely weaponized it into a boogeyman. Hydrocephalus, which was historically and quite frankly unpleasantly called water on the brain, is a severe medical condition. Before modern shunts and advanced surgical treatments were widely available like they are today, this condition did in fact lead to noticeably enlarged craniums in affected children. And we have to remember, in previous eras, society was incredibly, relentlessly cruel to anyone with physical differences. It breaks your heart to think about it, but these children were often hidden away from the public, they were institutionalized in really poor conditions, and they were subjected to immense, heartbreaking social stigmatization. Skeptics frequently point out a really sobering truth about all of this. Most of us today would rather teach our younger generation to have compassion and acceptance rather than vilifying people as monsters for our late-night fiction. And that really hits the nail on the head, doesn't it? Instead of empathizing with innocent children who were suffering from severe physical disfigurements and extreme medical hardships, society basically exiled them into our local mythology as these terrifying, violent mutants. It is a deeply, deeply haunting reflection of human prejudice. When people didn't understand an illness, they deliberately chose to fear it. They transformed completely innocent, suffering children into cannibalistic monsters, literally just to scare teenagers away from dark roads. So the real horror story here isn't the Melonheads at all, not even close.
The true horror is the profound lack of human compassion that allowed this myth to be created in the absolute first place. Let's actually look at the historical record to prove just how fabricated these stories truly are. If you track the actual timeline of Michigan's Felt Mansion, it completely dismantles the legend, piece by piece. Just track the timeline with me for a second. The mansion was built as a private home in the late 1920s. Then, in the late 40s, it became a Catholic seminary for boys. Moving into the 1970s, it became a state police post. And finally, a correctional facility before being abandoned in the 90s. Do you notice what is glaringly, completely missing from that entire historical record? That's right, the infamous Junction Insane Asylum literally never existed. Never. It is a complete 100% fabrication. It was just invented by locals to explain the naturally creepy vibes of a large abandoned institutional building sitting out in the middle of nowhere. And the contrast between the myth and the reality leads to an almost comical punchline regarding the Michigan legend. On one side, you have the terrifying myth. Feral, cannibalistic mutants born of unspeakable abuse, lurking in underground caves, waiting to violently attack unsuspecting hikers. But when dedicated researchers finally dug into the actual verified history of the property during its time as a St. Augustine seminary in the 1950s and 60s, they found a staggering, almost hilarious reality. The so-called Melonheads weren't monsters at all. No way. They were actually just highly intelligent, maybe slightly arrogant teenage boys attending a private Catholic prep school.
Yes, you heard that correctly. We literally have a former student who explicitly went on the public record to explain exactly what happened here. The terrifying cannibalistic mutants guarding the woods, yeah, they were actually just a bunch of preppy students known for having rather big egos. The local public school kids fiercely resented the wealthy private school kids, as kids often do, and they started calling them melonheads or wobbleheads. Basically, this was just the 1950s equivalent of calling someone an egghead or a massive nerd because they were smart. And somehow, over decades and decades, that simple, relatively harmless schoolyard bullying got twisted, warped, and combined with local ghost stories until the very concept of a smart prep school kid inexplicably morphed into a flesh-eating feral mutant. It's wild how a simple insult turns into an urban legend.
And the debunking over in Ohio is just as fascinating. Remember that intensely sinister Dr. Crow we talked about? A total fabrication. He has absolutely zero basis in any historical record. The actual reality, according to local historians who really dug through the archives, traces back to the 1960s. There was, in fact, a single preteen boy living near Wisner Road who actually did have hydrocephalus. But he wasn't a monster, and he certainly wasn't dangerous to anyone. Actually, he and his completely healthy, normal friends used to intentionally sneak up on teenagers who were parked in cars making out on the dark dirt road. They would just jump out of the bushes to scare them for a good laugh. You know, kids being kids. Well, the terrified teenagers would speed away, go back to school, and desperately try to save face by claiming they were violently attacked by these melonheads. And just like that, an entire legendary horror franchise was accidentally born from a simple, innocent, coming-of-age teenage prank. Okay, let's dive into this final analysis here. We have thoroughly busted the ghosts at this point. The terrifying asylums were actually just prep schools or minimum security prisons. The exceptionally evil doctors, they never existed in any capacity whatsoever. But that leaves us with a huge question. Why do these stories persist so stubbornly across so many different generations? Well, it's because these legends act as a vital cultural map. They perfectly encode our deeply communal anxieties. Think about it. If you are a parent, you absolutely do not want your kids wandering near a heavily vandalized abandoned prison or driving recklessly down a dangerous, unlit dirt road like Velvet Street in the dead of night. So, the community, collectively, almost unconsciously, invents a monster. The Melonhead becomes a physical manifestation of the boundary line. It's a terrifying, unmistakable warning sign that essentially says, do not cross into the unknown, or the unknown will utterly consume you. It's a way to keep people safe through fear.
So as we finish up this explainer, I want to leave you with this final, truly provocative thought. We as humans absolutely love to scare ourselves. It's human nature. We crave the thrill of the dark woods and the bump in the night. But when you really look closely at the deeply tragic medical realities, the awful societal prejudice, and the simple schoolyard bullying that actually birthed these tales, you really have to ask yourself a tough question. Are the monsters we whisper about in the dark truly hiding out there in the trees? Or do they just reflect our own deeply rooted fears, our darkest prejudices, and the things we completely fail to understand about each other? I'll let you be the judge of that. Thank you so much for exploring this incredible and frankly sad legend with me today, and I will catch you on the next explainer.